Okay, so if you are with us for the first time, just a brief explanation. The Kuiper Fellows Program is something we started last year, so this is our second year of it. It's a program in which we bring together a cohort of 5 or 6 graduate students who are Christians, and we spend the year trying to understand together what it looks like for a Christian academic to pursue a career in academia. What are the unique ways that a Christian ought to be engaging, teaching, research, mentoring, these other sorts of things that are part of the job of an academic. So last week, we got to hear 2 presentations from Rong and from Melanie, which were fantastic. And tonight, we get to hear 3 more. So we're first going to hear from David Simmons, then we're going to hear from Holly Shelton, and we're going to end with Ane Choi. So Holly is up next. Holly, I didn't even know you before you came into the Kuiper Fellows.
No.
So we took Holly into the program on faith, and it was a good choice. She brought, being here at UW, we skew, of course, towards the STEM fields. So to have someone from the humanities who brought a different vocabulary to our conversations is actually very helpful. So Holly is up next.
Thank you. It is so nice to hear someone actually value the humanities in this STEM field. So thank you, Jeff. That's awesome. Yeah, and speaking of questions to which you may not know the answer, I actually have a question from about 12 years ago, my very first teaching job in Chile. How many Spanish speakers in the room? A couple? All right, the name of the program that I was teaching with was called Inglés Abre Puertas. I had a really funny conversation with people in the airport, because that means English opens doors, and we were talking about it. We're like, where are these doors? What doors are going to be open here? Like, I mean, it was like the ideology of the program was kind of built into the name. So anyway, just that as a starting point, I feel like is somehow appropriate. So what I'm going to be focusing on tonight is kind of introducing a concept that is useful within disciplines. It's a concept that's kind of known within my field. It is threshold concepts, so I'm introducing a concept of a concept. So we'll talk about what that means. And then we're going to be talking about what it means to identify threshold concepts in an academic discipline, what it means to identify threshold concepts in, a form of spirituality, and then how you can maybe move between the two. And it's super complicated. So that's what we're moving to, is kind of that activity at the end. So I'm going to be basically introducing threshold concepts, modeling what that looked like for me, for both my discipline and my spirituality, and then giving you guys a chance to also do the same thing. You will probably need more time for it than I have to give you, but I have a handout that you can take and do on your own time. So, yes. And also, I do know the answer to that question, by the way, where are all the doors? I know where all the doors are because I've documented them in my slideshow because I love doors. So you'll keep seeing doors. Yeah, so I actually wanted to start off with a very specific verse from 1 Corinthians 13, 12 to 13. This is a verse that hit me at like a really hard time this year. I almost dropped out of grad school. So anyway, I put this verse at the top of the chapter that I was writing for my dissertation at the time, so it was the first thing I saw when I started writing. There were a couple reasons why this one in particular was useful. I am writing in ethnography, so I've been doing a lot of research in communities. What this basically reminded me of, my knowledge is partial. I only know what I know. I don't have to know everything. I don't have to be overwhelmed by not knowing everything. I just have to write what I know. And ultimately, the methodology that I'm using, ethnography, for me is really a practice of love. Love for my communities that I'm working with as well. So anyway, I actually included this as part of my writing process. I ended up sending out a draft in process to several people in my department for other reasons. I was actually trying to share with them some insights about Indigenous knowledge and ways of interacting with things. And then opened up the document later to work on it again and kind of had a minor freak out, oh my gosh, I sent it with this Bible verse on top. They're gonna totally judge me for that. But anyway, so significant verse, just wanted to mention it because it's important to remember that these things do impact us deeply. So, I have a lot of quotes on my slides. Don't worry about trying to read them all. I actually have a link to my slides as reference later if you want to explore them more deeply. Basically, there is a book on spirituality and language teaching. And Kanavaraja is someone really important in my field, writing studies and language teaching, who actually identifies that movements such as social constructionism, and this is something that I'll kind of unpack in the next slide, do talk about the ways that we're drawing on our experiences and our beliefs in order to, it gives us unique perspective on what we are investigating. And at the same time, our scholarly experiences and professional experiences can also add perspective to how we experience our faith as well. So that was kind of this like dual direction kind of approach. And also in another book, just recognizing like how we're pursuing truth, how other people are pursuing truth. This is actually really important to consider when we're doing any kind of inquiry, especially community-based inquiry like what I was doing. So just kind of noticing the role that it can have. Social construction, this is something that is very much talked about in my field. I don't know that it's depending on which field you're in, you may or may not be familiar. So I just wanted to say, social construction again deals with this idea of imperfect knowledge and the way that when people are socially organized, they all have little bits of impartial knowledge. Imperfect knowledge, not impartial. It's definitely partial knowledge. But yeah, so anyway, it's a bunch of imperfect knowledge, but then what you do with that knowledge together, it kind of constructs the world that you are existing and acting in. So anyway, Bakhtin's a really big name, Voloshin's a big name. Yeah, for linguistics, these kind of like contrast with systems like Saussure, who basically said that language was like imposing itself on individuals when actually it's more about like how people are socially enacting situations, and language comes from that. So just as some background. So what is a threshold concept? That's kind of where we're at. So threshold concepts are basically concepts as people are entering into a discipline or a community or some group. Threshold concepts are the things that are shared values or assumptions or beliefs. And they're kind of the things that are shared that you need to have in order to be recognized within that group, and also in order to function within that group. And also the other thing about threshold concepts is that they will like fundamentally change the way that you see the rest of the world as well. So kind of what David was saying with like the axiom of
choice.
Axiom of choice. Yeah, that's like something that mathematicians like, you have that. And it affects how you're able to see stuff. Melanie mentioned last time, sometimes she like sees things philosophically in other situations as well. So this is kind of what a threshold concept is. Within writing studies, this particular book identifies things. It was actually collaboratively created from people within my field, so it was a really interesting writing process, but these are kind of like the 5 basic things that are known, within writing studies. And if you want to see a full list, because we're all writing stuff, we're all dissertating, we're writing for publication, we're doing all the things that totally stress us out, and hopefully still enjoy sometimes. I actually summarized it there in a blog. So anyway, just as a resource, not a self-plug. It's not the best blog, just to know. And then if we zoom in, within kind of this concept 3.0, we really focus on, identities and ideologies and the role that that plays within writing and within, these threshold concepts. So this is within my discipline. I specifically highlighted concept 3.2, so writers' histories, processes, and identities vary, and also disciplinary and professional identities are constructed through writing. So these are things that I'm going to be particularly touching on tonight. And one thing that I just wanted to mention about the way that I've experienced the integration or lack of integration between, disciplinary or educational settings and, spirituality has a lot of times been that it's been kind of a taboo. And so anyway, I guess I would say the first chance that I had to see where there was value from my belief system actually came at some point in my high school. And this was inconceivable to me at the time, but we were reading some literature. One of the stories was actually called The First 7 Years. I wrote down who wrote that. That was Bernard Malamud. Yeah, so it was actually a Jewish author. He was writing about someone who worked in a shoe shop. He was looking for a husband for his daughter. And, I read the author bio, I read the title of the story, and I was like, okay, there's something gonna go on with this marriage thing. Because the first 7 years assumes a second set of 7 years. And we know that 2 sets of 7 years has something to do probably with the story of Jacob and Rachel and Leah. So none of my classmates really got that, and I just kind of I think I just wrote it down, and I wasn't even thinking of it as this connection between a faith background or anything. But my teacher was like, "How did you know that?" And I was like, "Oh, I just did," And it was that first moment when I realized, actually there's value, I do have insight in some way, and it wasn't immediately shut down. So anyway, just noticing that, histories and processes and identities, they are different for ourselves and for any students that we're working with as well. So anyway, thinking about disciplinary and professional identities, a lot of us are going through this at the moment. So anyway, there's a lot more that could be said about these, but I'm going to kind of shift from focusing on my own disciplines writing threshold concepts at this point, and kind of shift into what this meant spiritually. So you'll notice I'm a very visual person. When I was trying to figure out okay, what do I do with this? This is a really big topic. I just went with a picture. So my purpose with this particular bracelet is not to talk about doctrine, but to talk about values and kind of some base values within Christianity. And I will say a lot of times I describe myself as a follower of Jesus, not necessarily a Christian, but that comes from a couple times that I've lived, as a minority believer in other contexts, and it kind of, it translates better with friends that I've had, and kind of reflects a lot of things. That's another conversation for another time. Ask me about it if you want to know. How many people have ever worn a bracelet like this? Oh, good number. Oh my gosh. Okay, I'm so excited. This was totally a thing when I was a child, and I never see them nowadays. And I actually didn't know that they had a name. I met someone at one point, and they're like, "Oh, you've got a wordless wolf bracelet," and I was like, "Is that what it is?" I don't even know. So anyway, it was something we created as crafts as a kid. So basically, each of these colors means something. I'm going to just briefly contextualize for people who have not seen these things before. It's supposed to represent all aspects of a Christian's walk. The black being death, separation from God. The red being the blood of Christ as a sacrifice. The white being new life, being a new creation after the blood. Blue being baptism and commitment to transformation in your life. Green being, again, growing and walking more in faith. Purple being maturity. I don't know if anyone ever reaches purple, but it's you have to have that thing in mind, or, you'll just stay in green forever. So anyway, and then the yellow being kind of the heavenly realm of having that perspective of, ultimate culmination of grace and justice. So anyway, also knowing that, it's not only what happens here, there is something after. So a lot of the threshold concepts I'm talking about are somehow represented with this. So you'll also notice I am doing something called, what is that called, road mapping, and previewing things. I'm looking specifically at people in my program. There's a better word for it, but I basically also just previewed something about the color of the rest of my slides, so keep it in mind. There's extra meaning hidden in here. So anyway, starting with black. As a student and, as someone who does have faith, there are a lot of ways that you can feel very separated from your discipline, from your faith. And Bartholomew is a really big name within the field of writing studies, composition. And basically what Bartholomew talks about is students are asked to perform as if they're insiders before they are actually insiders. And there's a lot of problems that come from that, a lot of ways that, it's hard to read their work, they're not like speaking the language of the academy. There's a lot of challenges there. And then also, Walter Storff, in his article, was actually writing about, people who would be Christian scholars, was actually saying, when you speak, it has to be a voice that can be heard. So what he was referring to is when people bring up faith in like a secular academic setting, sometimes they'll get pushback, but it's not always, the default is to think, okay, my faith is under attack. Sometimes it's just that the student isn't actually engaging in the dialogue in the discipline, but is kind of like, they don't know how to engage in a way that still includes who they are and what they find interesting. So anyway, just kind of noticing, that's why this is on the black slide, because it's there is this separation, there is this process that happens, and it is it can be a very painful separation. Red, Lesson of Grace. This is actually an article that I've shared it with several people since I came across it. This also was an article that helped me a lot during my really rough time. So basically just the author of this particular piece, Sue, was just defining grace. Firstly, this was someone who was earning an award as a mathematics teacher. So, David, yes, some math teachers are being appreciated somewhere, not, I don't know where.
It was the JMM.
Yes. So anyway, just establishing and remembering your accomplishments are not what make you a worthy human being. You receive grace, that's how you learn that. You get good things, you didn't earn or deserve them, but you're getting them anyway. And I feel like this is something that every grad student needs to know. We feel a lot of pressure for our performances. There's a lot of ways in the systems that push us towards this. And just anybody who's ever felt imposter syndrome, yeah, okay, people who are not even scholars, we feel it, right? So anyway, yeah, just kind of remembering to tap into that lesson of grace can be super important in that. So this is kind of a way that having a spiritual perspective can help mediate some of the tensions that an academic setting can bring, or otherwise not just academic. Now, in the other direction, ways that insights from disciplines can also shape the way that people are thinking about their spirituality. This was another thing that I did this year that was pretty major. I shifted my faith community. I moved churches, and that was not a big thing. I've been with the same church for 4 years, and it's really hard to do that. So anyway, it can be easy. You can just walk out a door, but it's relationships and everything else that means. So specifically, I titled this one "Spirituality Beyond Cultural Captivity" because there are ways that the very situated natures of our faith communities can also have influences that are based on culture and that aren't necessarily from God. So for me, part of my process, both Christian and otherwise scholars, Pavlenko actually has written a lot about language and emotion. Ra was writing about immigrant churches and the role that they've had in the U.S. in terms of keeping Christianity healthy. This takeaway was that multilinguals tend to interact with and gravitate to other multilinguals regardless of their language or cultural background. It doesn't always have to be the same language, but they generally get each other. I'll just say that. And particularly for U.S. churches, individualism and capitalism have impacted the health of these churches. So things that are sometimes conflated are actually different, and they can really impact how it's expressed. Yancey is a sociologist, also a Christian, but was identifying ways that racism, for example, is a sin. Firstly, that was the first thing, was identifying racism as a sin. Secondly, it's individual and systemic. So some churches will focus on the individual side, some will focus on systematic, but they're both actually really important. And then also just noticing that there is a disconnect between evangelical scholarship and thinking that goes on in specific congregations. So for me, I mean, this is a bit extreme, but it kind of points to the fact that evangelicalism is a mission field for evangelical scholarship. So noticing that what we are learning about actually has implications for how we understand our spirituality. And this particular term, Kanagaraja, going back to the first person that I referenced, I met him in a conference recently, and I was actually talking with him about his book. I think most people don't talk with him about that particular book. They talk with him about like translingualism and, you know, stuff we know. You know, he was asking me, he's like, well, are you evangelical? And I was like, I really don't like that term. Like, I feel like it's a political category now. It's not like, it's not being used in a way that I relate to. And he's like, yes, I know, but I also don't want to let them have it. You know, and like, you know, who knows if them is like, you know, media, or if it's like the really problematic elements within evangelicalism. But anyway, so I've kind of focused on some ways that also academic engagement also impacts noticing broader trends within spirituality and not feeling like you're the only one experiencing something. Okay. So, note on transformation, this is the slide where we're like talking about the mutual informing nature of threshold concepts. So it's not directly one influencing the other, it's actually both of them moving together. The first book I'm referencing is actually from the field of education, talking about disparity gaps. The title is very clear, like start where you are but don't stay there. Yeah, I mean, we all start somewhere, so figure out where you need to go from there. Bell Press is the church that I have been going to since then. This was at a panel specifically addressing race issues within the church and outside. And he said guilt is not a useful emotion, conviction is, because conviction requires a response. You can't just feel guilty and stay there, like you have to do something about it. And that is also a threshold concept of the faith. And then also, in this particular article, it was interesting because there was kind of a discourse analysis from someone who's not a discourse analyst, talking about different ways that like political cults are kind of taking the place of spirituality in a lot of ways. Like this faith in a political system is somehow being conflated. So noticing that, you know, for social justice, you know, you have to admit white privilege, and when a Christian is born again, an activist gets woke. So it's still like, it's tapping into like very spiritual values, but like doing it in a way that's very like conflated. So it was a really interesting article and helped me also be like, okay, this is like, anyway, perspective. Most of what I'm talking about tonight is perspective. And then also another speaker from a Bell Press event is, you know, we're not perfect, but in process. So again, allowing ourselves grace in the process, but also like still committing to growing, both as academics and as people on a spiritual path. So, activity, which I will pass out to everyone. I'm going to just give you everything. It was given as like individual things. So basically what I did, I talked about identifying threshold concepts within my discipline, identifying threshold concepts within my spirituality, and then also identifying like where these confluence or even conflicts between those two systems were. Okay, so that's what I'm going to actually give you right now. And we may not actually have time to complete it, but I will say this takes a lot of reflection time. So if you would prefer to do it later, I was hoping to have more time to like have some discussion at tables, so I'm really sorry I got very passionate, I think, and just like went on a roll here. Yeah, if this is a useful tool for me, I feel like it helped me. And as you're kind of looking at that and thinking about that, I did want to mention, so the bottom of the that handout does have a link to these slides. There are a ton of references that you cannot read because they're super tiny. But if you follow the link, you can see all the references that I used. You'll notice that these are the mature scholars. They're very purple. Thank you, Elizabeth. I appreciate that you liked that. And I also wanted to finish with some special acknowledgments. Growth comes only from love. That is another threshold concept. And I wanted to thank Jeff. Thank you so much for facilitating the Kuiper Fellows this year. To my Kuiper Fellow cohorts, Christina's not here today, but Renee, and Ron, David, and Melanie. And then also to James. Can you raise your hand real quick? James was my faculty mentor this year from Department of History. Some differing threshold concepts, but like he was the first one to give me feedback on that really rough chapter that I wrote. So anyway.
Did the other ones give you feedback right now?
They did,
Okay.
yes, but you were the first, and I really appreciate that. I asked him to read like 2 sections, and he read like the whole thing, so that was awesome. To the dissertation committee, and also to 2 friends who could not be here tonight, Jen Ho Weatherford, she works at Bellevue College now, and Nora Fahim at Stanford, for giving me feedback on the project. And yeah, anyway. Heavenly Realms here. So thank you, Heavenly Realms. So, yeah.
So we have a few minutes if anybody has any questions.
You mentioned doing ethnography work on other communities. How would you describe your countertransference in reference to your own personal values when studying those communities?
Yeah, like what values did they have
that challenged yours? What was your response to that? How did your own personal values change or stay the same?
Yeah, that is a really good question. And I would definitely say that, especially within, I mentioned like indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing. One of the language groups that I was working with was Southern which is the language of the local Duwamish people the University of Washington occupies their traditional lands. And it was really interesting because some of the ways that the teacher would talk about this, she would say, there's hurt in the past. You have to know about the hurt in order to like understand fully, the community and the language. But we're trying to like turn it and make it healthy. And that's one person's perspective. It's not like everyone's perspective. But there was that aspect of it. And also the fact that in that class they did talk about other ways of knowing. So, dreams were actually very significant. So sometimes they would just come up during class. And it was really similar to some past experiences that I had when I was living in Muslim majority countries where, when I talked with my friends, we would talk about our dreams. And it was like, that was totally a normal thing for us. So I think just the acknowledgement that, yes, the spiritual realm is real, and it's like active, is something that I think in a lot of like secular, settings, people just don't acknowledge it at all. So I don't know. In some ways, it was actually really refreshing to work with a community like that, where it was like, okay, that is a threshold concept that we share, even if we have really different pictures or ideas of what that looks like. So.
So you talked a little bit about how these threshold concepts and this idea has impacted your own personal academic journey. And so how do you take these concepts and this way of thinking about knowledge and the world and share it with the other people in your discipline or the students that you're working with as you are academics?
Yeah. I guess I would say it's about creating occasions for it. As I mentioned before, especially when I was an undergrad, also many times as a university student, it was kind of an active taboo. You do not talk about religion. I think in a lot of ways, the kind of assignments that I create or like the kinds of questions that I ask students during office hours incorporate like the unique perspectives that they're bringing. So, this year I teach a science link writing class. So the students are all registered for biology, large, like 700-person lecture. I've also visited the lectures. It's a different situation than my class where we've got 18 people meeting intensely, and it's different. So we kind of take some of these things like rhetorical appeals, noticing like how people are giving information and why, and noticing, okay, what are the values that are being communicated, and kind of like putting that back on the biology class so that they can start identifying, these are not just neutral aspects of knowledge, and especially when they're being asked to differentiate, okay, how would a scientist react to this situation? How would a pseudoscientist react to it? And how would a religious person act to it? Like, it really forces a separation between all those ways of knowing. So I think for my classes, it's about creating occasions, but also like helping them to do that in a way that they can find a voice that engages with the discipline at the same time. Does that answer your question? Okay.
So actually, I really appreciated kind of you're using the threshold concepts as a framework. So I guess I've encountered them in like critical race theory and even faith formation. There tend to be a lot of threshold concepts. One of the problems is that kind of the last threshold is always like the right answer, or enlightenment, or universalizing, or whatever. So I guess without that burden, how would you kind of characterize or describe the threshold where you're in right now as a scholar, as a follower of Jesus? And without any fear of like, this sounds like I'm saying the right answer. Yeah. So how would you characterize it?
Yeah, I mean, it really does feel like, okay, I can see these doors. Like at this point, I'm kind of like oriented. I'm like, okay, I can see these are values in the field. I'm trying to step through them, but I'm also not completely, like I fail sometimes. Like, I trip on the doorstep or something like that. But at the same time, I'm able to recognize that they're there. So I think that that's a different place than someone who's like a complete insider, or someone who's just like doesn't even know where the doors are and is like feeling on the wall like this. Sometimes we feel like that. But I mean, I guess I would say, in terms of spirituality, like I feel like I've already been through a door, for a very long time. Like I actually cannot remember a time when I was not a follower of Jesus. But at the same time, like that door was like in a completely different area from all the other doors. And there was like no way to kind of reach across or like find where they were connected. To kind of go with the metaphors with that. Yeah.
So you spoke about grace earlier. I was wondering, so grace as a kindness, as a gentleness, how do you go about embodying or practicing that in academic circles?
Yeah, so I think a lot of times that it means, I think of it in my teaching, or, if my students, I can tell they're going through a hard time, I'm not going to focus on like the deadline of their assignment. I'm going to ask them like, how are you? Like, really focus on them as a person and not like the thing that they need to give me as a product. And I think a lot of times it does deal with the interpersonal interactions, how you see people, how you engage with them. And I would definitely say it also gives you that freedom. Like one of those threshold concepts for writing studies is sometimes you need to fail. Like you can ethically fail someone if they need to be failed, but like still engage with them like in a way that values their humanity. And so anyway, not to focus just on the failing side, but it's I think it's more about like seeing the person rather than their thing, more so. Did that answer your question, Ahmed? Because I feel like I kind of like went one direction with it. I feel like there could be many directions.
It answered part of the question.
It answered part of the question. Okay, tell me your question more fully, because
We kind of gentleness and kindness is something we should embody for other people, but it's also something we need to embody for ourselves.
Yeah.
So, and what are you doing in that sense for yourself within being in academia?
Right. Thank you for bringing that up. Yes, it's not just about giving grace to other people, but giving grace to myself. So, yeah, when I'm really disappointed that I did not, for example, finish a project that I'm supposed to be presenting with Ahmed on Monday. Sorry, Ahmed. I'm giving myself grace, but it totally affects you too. I'm like, it's okay for me to go to bed right now. But yeah, at the same time, just like recognizing that I have limits, and then also being like, okay, I can forgive myself too. I can forgive other people, but I can also forgive myself. Is that a better? Okay, cool. I feel like I've gone a super long time. So.
That's all right. Thank you.